about site response analysis, and we talked on the second day about liquefaction. And this morning I'm going to talk about site response of liquefiable soil profiles, which we have to analyze by means of effective stress analysis, or nonlinear effective stress analysis. Again, when we look at the effects of liquefaction, we can break them down into two primary categories. One that deals with site response, and we want to understand the effects of liquefaction on the amplitude, frequency, content, and duration of earthquake ground motions. We'll also talk about ground failure problems, which we have spoken about already, in terms of lateral spreading and flow sliding and settlement. Both of these are going to be influenced when we have liquefiable soils by the nature and amount of pore pressure that are generated in loose saturated soils. So, to repeat a little bit of what I talked about yesterday, the behavior of liquefiable soils is very strongly influenced by phase transformation behavior. And if we're going to try to model the response of liquefiable soil profiles, it's essential that we capture the phase transformation behavior in our models. So we have a phase transformation line that is somewhat flatter than our failure surface that divides conditions where we expect contracted behavior from conditions where we expect dilated behavior. The soil is contractive when we are below the phase transformation line. When we reach the phase transformation line with an effective stress path, we're not generating pore pressure. The soil is neither contractive nor dilated at this point, at least temporarily. It's changing from contractive to dilated behavior. When we cross the phase transformation line, the soil is dilated. And so pore pressures are going down, effective stresses are going up. Loose soils are more contractive than dense soils. Dense soils may only be contracted for a very small range of strains, and then they may dilate strongly for positive shear stresses and for negative shear stresses. If we apply cyclic loading, pore pressures will build up. With each cycle of loading, if our stress amplitude is low, the cyclic stress ratio is low, it'll take a lot of cycles to build up significant amounts of pore pressure. Since we saw this yesterday, but we start to hit the phase transformation line, and then the rate of pore pressure generation increases. And so our effective stresses will decrease quickly at this point from cycle to cycle, and eventually our stress path will stabilize, and we'll be repeating essentially the same stress path with each cycle. We know that stresses and strains continue to increase, and we attribute that to damage to the fabric of the soil, or degradation of the fabric of the soil, so we get increasing amounts of strain even after the effective stresses have stabilized. If we have high levels of shear stress, high cyclic stresses, we build up pore pressure much more quickly, and we see that our effective stresses are decreasing from one cycle to the next, but even within a cycle, they're increasing and decreasing. As the effective stresses increase and decrease, the stiffness of the soil is going to change. So it will soften generally from one cycle to the next, but it will exhibit soft and stiffer behavior even within a loading cycle. And so we see changes in stiffness throughout a load cycle. So the soil, when the effective stresses are low, becomes very, very soft. But as it starts to dilate, the stiffness increases and can increase significantly depending on the rate of dilation. So our stiffness in the liquefiable soil is going to decrease for two reasons. One is due to the strain that's induced in the soil. We know that soils are not linear, so as the strain level increases, the stiffness decreases. But they'll also change due to the generation of pore water pressure. Our effective stresses will decrease, and as they decrease, the stiffness of the soil is going to decrease. So, from what we understand about site response, we know that the response of the site is influenced by frequency. We saw transfer functions 2 days ago, that interact with the frequency content of an input motion to produce an output motion. And when we have a soft profile, our transfer function amplified low-frequency motions and de-amplified high-frequency motions. With a stiff profile, we amplified higher frequencies. So in a sense, when we see the stiffness of the soil changing drastically during an earthquake, we have a transfer function that's changing as the earthquake proceeds, as the ground motion proceeds. If we have a very soft profile, we should expect it to amplify long period of low frequency motions, and we should expect it to de-amplify high frequency motions. When we look at accelerations are influenced most strongly by high frequency motions. And so we can expect that high frequencies are attenuated and lower frequencies are amplified, but acceleration amplitudes will be decreased, and displacement amplitudes, which are related to the long period from low frequency motions, will increase. And we see this when we have recordings of ground motions that are underlain by liquefiable soils. So this famous photograph is from the Nevada earthquake, the Kawakishi-Jo apartment buildings. And the record that's shown below here was recorded on the same soil profiles, but near these apartment buildings. And so we can see very clearly here that in the first 7 seconds of this motion, we have a lot of high frequencies that are coming up and being transmitted all the way up to the ground surface. The soils had not liquefied yet. They were relatively stiff. The transfer function at its peak at higher frequencies, and these high frequencies were amplified. But then, at about 7 seconds or so, the soil liquefied. And when it liquefied, the transfer function shifted towards low frequencies. High frequencies were no longer able to be transmitted up to the surface, at least not as much of the high frequencies came up to the ground surface. And we see a very low frequency motion after the soil had liquefied. So there's a transition in the stiffness of the soil, a drastic transition in the stiffness of the soil when it liquefies. So if we looked at our transfer function, we've developed this before, and we can express it in this kind of a form, and we see that it depends on the frequencies, very, very strongly dependent on the frequency, and the frequency is also depends on the shear modulus, or the shear wave velocity, the stiffness of the soil. So if we looked at, say, a 40-foot thick soil layer, just a uniform elastic layer, if we assume it had a shear wave velocity of 1,600 feet per second, so about 500 meters per second, it would be amplifying 10 hertz motions, relatively high frequencies. But if the shear wave velocity was 4 times lower, then our transfer function would shift to lower frequencies. We would amplify these lower frequencies, and we would de-amplify higher frequencies. And so we might start out with a soil profile, a layer of saturated sand that has a relatively high stiffness because the effective stresses are high. But during the earthquake, as pore pressures are generated, the effective stress decreases and the stiffness of the soil decreases. And so during the earthquake now, the transfer function, if we can think of an instantaneous transfer function, is starting to shift towards lower frequencies because the soil profile is becoming softer. And as more pore pressure builds up, the profile becomes softer and softer and softer, and eventually it may become very soft. In which case now we're amplifying low frequency motions and we're de-amplifying higher frequency motions. So there are pore pressure induced changes in stiffness that we can't model if we're using a total stress analysis. Even a total stress nonlinear analysis, we have to account for pore pressure development. So we need to use nonlinear effective stress analyses, and that means we need a pore pressure model or a constitutive model that can represent this kind of behavior. We talked a little bit about the wildlife array yesterday. It's located in Southern California near the Mexican border. just near the Alamo River. It was instrumented in 1982 and had 2 earthquakes in 1987. Elmore Ranch, there was a magnitude 6.2. The next day, the Superstition Hills earthquake occurred and had a magnitude of 6.6. The Elmore Ranch earthquake did not cause liquefaction, but the Superstition Hills earthquake did. There were instruments above and below a liquefiable layer. There were 5 pore pressure transducers. 4 of them very clearly did not work. The 5th one was believed to have worked by the people who installed it, but a lot of people had questions about it, and we now believe that this pore pressure record is not very accurate. But it's shown here, along with the north-south accelerogram that was recorded in the Superstition Hills earthquake. And so there were 4 stages, one in which we had very high frequencies being transmitted up to the ground surface, so we had high accelerations. No pore pressure, almost no pore pressure was recorded during this stage by that one pore pressure transducer. Then there was some transitional stage where we went from high frequencies to lower frequencies, but we had some pulses, kind of unusually shaped pulses that occurred. The pore pressure, recorded pore pressure, was building up at that point, and we had a pore pressure ratio of maybe 0.5, meaning that the effective stress was half of the original effective stress at that location. At least that was the measured value. And then we had lower frequency motions occurring with some pulses superimposed upon them, followed by relatively weak shaking at low frequencies with some more of these pulses. And as we said yesterday, these pulses coincided with local drops in the pore water pressure, meaning that the effective stress had increased at these times. And so there are a series of these pulses that occurred. We have to try to predict this type of behavior, and we do that by nonlinear effective stress analyses, and there are a number of computer programs now that are available to perform this type of analysis. They need some sort of constitutive model for stress strain models capable of predicting pore pressure generation and its effects on the stiffness of the soil. So we have to be able to allow pore pressure generation. We have to have a good model, be able to handle pore phase transformation behavior. It needs to be something that we can calibrate in a reasonable way. Some constitutive models have many, many parameters associated with them, some 20, 25, 27 parameters, not all of which have a direct physical meaning. So ideally, we would have a model that can represent the behavior accurately and be calibrated using parameters that are familiar to us and easily obtained. And so I had developed one that I described yesterday. This is an earlier version of it, but it captures the generation of pore water pressure and it captures phase transformation behavior. So it's shown here for a material with a standard penetration resistance of 10 blows per foot. Requires 6 cycles for initial liquefaction to occur. At 15 blows per foot, pore pressures are generated more slowly. It requires 17 cycles for liquefaction to occur. When I used that analysis and applied it to the Elmore Ranch earthquake and effective stress analysis, used the recorded ground motion below the liquefiable layer of the pinpoint and attempted to predict the ground surface motion. If we look at the stronger part of shaking, the prediction in both the north-south and east-west directions is pretty good. The response spectra are matched pretty well, and so I consider this to be a very good prediction of a non-liquefaction event. Some pore pressure was generated, but not enough to trigger liquefaction. If we look at the Superstition Hills record and perform total stress analyses, both using using nonlinear and equivalent linear analyses, which these total stress analyses are often used in current practice. We can see that in the early stages, there's reasonable agreement, but later on, in this particular record, the agreement is poor. It's not as good. But if we're comparing a total stress equivalent linear analysis with a total stress non-linear analysis, if the level of strain is not extremely high, they should agree with each other reasonably, and they do agree with each other reasonably here. If we look at reality, however, the recorded motion here in the north-south direction is shown above, and the prediction of the model is shown below. And so in the early stages, the first perhaps 13 seconds or so, they both predict high frequencies. And after that, there's a transition towards lower frequencies with some pulses being observed. And there's a period of time where we're seeing lower frequency motions in both cases. There's some little numerical high frequency oscillations here that should not be there. It's not an uncommon thing to see in a total and effective stress analysis, but it's something that needs to be removed. And we see some weaker shaking at the end, but we see these dilation pulses that develop due to phase transformation. As the soil dilates, it becomes stiffer, and that can lead, even after it's liquefied, to some of these pulses. And the general nature of the pulses is captured relatively well by the program in this particular case. If we look at the velocities and compare the velocities, they agree with each other reasonably well. The response spectrum, the numerical model predicts a little bit higher acceleration level, and it underpredicts the longer period component of the motion. So it's a good, but not a perfect prediction of the wildlife array's response. One of the advantages of an effective stress analysis is it allows us to look inside the soil layer and see where the pore pressures are building up and where the strains are developing. And so these colors here are coded to time. So blue represents the very early stages, and we can see in these soil layers that when the color is blue, it's kind of overwritten, but the stiffness is high. As we move towards the end of the earthquake, we reach the yellow and red colors, and we can see that that's where the soil is behaving with much lower stiffness. And we can see at this layer, at about 5 meters depth, we start to build up an accumulation of strain that will lead to displacement of the ground surface. So it's very helpful to be able to see these things. Port Island is off the coast of Kobe, Japan. It's an artificial island that was constructed out in Osaka Bay. It has 4 downhole accelerometers, but no pore pressure transducers. So the accelerometers were at depths of 0 at the ground surface, 16 meters, 32 meters, and 83 meters depth. So ground motions were recorded at each of those locations. The island was constructed by placing a decomposed granite fill material into water. And so the material was just dumped into the water, and then as it rose up above the water level, it was compacted at that point. There are some loose, saturated granular materials beneath Port Island, and liquefaction, extensive liquefaction occurred across Port Island during that earthquake. Here is the recorded motion at the surface in the east-west direction. This is the recorded motion in the north-south direction. The soil was very loose there, so there was high-frequency motions occurring from about 4 seconds here to about 7 seconds or so. Not a very strong level of shaking, but it was enough to cause these very loose soils to liquefy. And once they liquefied, then they became much softer, and the higher frequencies are decreased and low frequencies are increased. The behavior was complicated. The model prediction shows high frequencies in the first up to 7 seconds or so, followed by lower frequencies. And the accelerations are not matched exactly, but pore pressure generation caused liquefaction to be triggered at about the time that it occurred in the field. We have a transition to lower frequency loading with some pulses occurring, but the soils there were so loose that they were not strongly dilated, and there are not a lot of pulses in the recorded ground motion. And so this is the prediction of this behavior, and the bottom one is the prediction of this behavior. So not as good as wildlife, but still captured the transition from high frequencies to low frequencies reasonably well. So we have a high frequency portion followed by a low frequency portion followed by relatively weak shaking throughout the duration of this event. The response spectra show a low peak acceleration. It was a little bit over-predicted by the model and shows some strong long period motions that were somewhat under-predicted by the model. So it's a good prediction in general, but it's not capturing every aspect of the behavior. But it's a one-dimensional analysis of a three-dimensional problem, and so we shouldn't expect it to have a perfect match. Again, we can look inside the profile and see where the pore pressures are developing and where the strains are developing. And you can see the pore pressures are building up very quickly here. It only took a few cycles of loading for liquefaction to be triggered. And then we have the phase transformation behavior with dilation and contraction occurring. The stiffness of the soil is low because the effective stresses in all of these layers become very low. And we see soft behavior out here with some accumulation of strains being predicted as we get later and later into the record. So Messiaen and one of his students wanted to look at the effects of liquefaction on site response. What does this do to a response spectrum, for example? So we often use response spectra for design purposes or for selection of earthquake ground motions that we use in design or evaluation analyses. So they use the Crochet code to do equivalent linear analyses. First of the Elmore Ranch record where liquefaction did not occur. And they found a pretty good match between the results of their wildlife analysis with a total stress equivalent linear analysis for the case where liquefaction did not occur. But when liquefaction did occur, they found that they had reasonable agreement in the first 13 seconds or so, but then they differed substantially. And so they interpreted this as the onset of liquefaction at that point. Their equivalent linear analyses maintained higher frequencies after liquefaction had been actually triggered because it can't account for pore pressure-induced softening. A total stress analysis will maintain constant effective stresses. It will capture the strain-induced nonlinearity, but it won't capture the pore pressure-induced nonlinearity or softening. So the response spectra that they had predicted with the total stress analysis was much higher than was observed in recorded motion at low periods or higher frequencies. So it over-predicted the high frequency response, and it under-predicted the low frequency or longer period response for the Superstition Hills wildlife record. So a total stress analysis will have a tendency to over-predict that aspect of the response and under-predict the longer period components. So they looked at 5 case histories where ground motions had been recorded on the surface of a liquefiable soil profile, and they found similar behavior in all of these and concluded that the occurrence of liquefaction causes the effective stresses, it causes the spectral accelerations to be decreased at low periods, in a range of periods less than 0.7 to 1 second, and to be increased at longer periods. And this is what we should expect thinking about transfer functions. We expect that as our soil profile becomes softer, we're going to be de-amplifying the high frequency components of the motion and amplifying the low frequency components. And so short periods should decrease, short period spectral accelerations should decrease, long period spectral accelerations should increase. I had a master's student who I asked to look at this issue in a little more detail. So he developed a series of trial soil profiles and ran total stress and effective stress nonlinear analyses. So he would analyze a soil profile twice, once assuming that no pore pressure would be generated, and then again assuming that pore pressure would be generated as it would in a liquefiable soil profile. He compared the results to see what the effects of pore pressure generation would be on response spectra. And our ultimate goal was to come up with a predictive model that would allow correction of a total stress analysis for the effects of liquefaction. So we took an input-based motion, propagated it through a soil profile, calculated the ground surface motion in total stress analysis, and then we repeated it in an effective stress analysis where pore pressures were allowed to be generated. We calculated the response spectra at the surface for both cases, and then we took the ratio of them. And so we defined the response spectral ratio as the ratio of the spectral acceleration with pore pressure generation to the spectral acceleration without pore pressure generation. So that ratio for a particular motion looked like this. The value was less than 1 for periods up to about 1 second or so, indicating that the short period or high frequency response was decreasing due to liquefaction, and it was greater than 1 for longer periods, indicating that the long period or low frequency part would be amplified, which is what we had expected. So he used 140 ground motions over a range of magnitudes and a range of distances, had 9 soil profiles with different thicknesses of the saturated sand level and different soil densities characterized by the clean sand SPT resistance. And he plotted these ratios as a function of a loading parameter. The loading parameter is effectively the inverse or reciprocal of the factor of safety against liquefaction. So if we have a factor of safety of about 2, we wouldn't expect too much pore pressure generation, and we shouldn't expect then that our effective stress analyses are going to produce very different results than our total stress analysis. And we found that the ratio was approximately equal to 1. There was a little bit of pore pressure generation that caused a reduction in spectral accelerations in a range of maybe 0.1, 0.2 seconds or so. There was a little bit of amplification out at the longer periods where we went to a factor of safety. If we look at the results with a factor of safety of about 1.5, that effect is a little bit more significant. If we go to 1.1, where now we're generating significant pore pressure, but we're not liquefying the soil, we see that the ratio drops below 1 at short periods, down around 0.2 to 0.3 seconds or so. It drops down even more, and we see ratios greater than 1 out at longer periods. When we get to a factor of safety of 1, now the soil is just on the verge of liquefaction. We see lower short period spectral accelerations due to the softening and pore pressure that's built up, and we see increased longer period spectral accelerations. If we go to 0.8 and then 0.67 and 0.6 and 0.5, we see that these effects become more pronounced, more significant. So our short periods, spectral accelerations on average are about 60% of what we would get from a total stress analysis, and our long period accelerations are greater than what we would get from a total stress analysis. And so when we put all this together and fit a function to it, we saw something that looked like this. When the loading parameter is 0, that would correspond to a factor of safety of infinity, which would mean effectively no pore pressure generation. And if we have no pore pressure generation, an effective stress nonlinear analysis and a total stress nonlinear analysis should give us exactly the same result. And so we see that occurring here. As the loading parameter increases, our factor of safety decreases, so we're going to a looser and looser soil with stronger and stronger ground motions. And we see that on short periods, say 10 to the minus 2 seconds, 0.01 seconds, which is a close approximation of the peak acceleration. We see that it decreases as our factor of safety decreases. We can see that there's an intermediate range of periods where the spectral acceleration is decreased even more. And if we come out to longer periods, lower frequencies, we see that it's being amplified by the effects of pore pressure generation. And so we look at the uncertainty and try to characterize that. We look at plus or minus 1 standard deviation. We see surfaces that look like this. Another aspect, so this effect of pore pressure generation is as we should expect it to be based on what we understand about wave propagation and site response. High pore pressures lead to low stiffnesses, and it tends to reduce the high frequencies, and it tends to increase the low frequencies. These dilation pulses can kind of violate that theory, however, because in some cases we may find that these dilation pulses produce the peak ground acceleration in a record that has been, ground motion has been recorded on top of a liquefiable soil profile. And so there are unusual, but there definitely are cases where peak acceleration would be reached after liquefaction has been triggered. It seems the opposite of what we should expect to see, but it shows that in a relatively dense soil that has liquefied, that dilation tendency, when we reach the phase transformation condition, can be so strong as to send very sharp pulses of acceleration. They're very high frequency, but they can be sharp pulses that go up to the surface, and that produces the peak ground acceleration. So we need to be aware of that potential. All of those analyses were for level ground conditions. If we take a one-dimensional analysis and tilt it a little bit, we can apply a shear stress, a static shear stress, and simulate, say, the response of an infinite slope. And that can give us an insight into soil behavior and lateral spreading behavior. So here's the results of analysis. A nonlinear effective stress analysis is performed on a soil profile that had some liquefiable soil and was level. So no shear stresses tending to push the soil profile in one direction or the other. The final displacements at the end of this record are quite small. They're really just due to the fact that the ground motion, the input motion, is not perfectly symmetrical. If we apply a small slope to this and repeat the analysis without changing anything else, for a 1 degree slope, when the soil liquefies, we start to see it straining and developing displacement in one direction. And about 30 centimeters of downslope displacement occurred by the end of the ground shaking here. If we increase that slope to 2 degrees, we see that liquefaction actually seems to be triggered a little bit earlier. We start building up displacements, and our displacements are somewhat greater. They occur more quickly, and they're somewhat greater than the displacements we had for a 1 degree slope. So the steeper slope is leading to a little bit more permanent displacement. When we go to 3 degrees, we see, and again, I tell my students never use yellow curves on a white background. I've done it here. What we see, if you can see it, is that the displacement, the final displacement, is smaller than it was for 2 degrees. And if we go to a steeper slope yet of 4 degrees, we see that the displacement is reduced. So for this particular condition of lateral spreading of an infinite slope, it gives us the impression that steeper slopes are moving less than flatter slopes, which is the opposite of what we would normally expect. So we'd like to understand why this happens. Is there error in our analysis, or does this reflect some aspect of soil behavior? And we can see that by, again, looking inside the liquefiable layer to see how it behaves. So there are 5 layers here of saturated soil and 1 that's not saturated. And so if we start at the bottom, the stress path is showing a constant effective stress. Shear stress is increase and decrease, but there's no increase in pore line pressure, so the effective stress, the vertical effective stress remains the same. The soil exhibits a stiff behavior. The stress strain curve is quite stiff and it doesn't change significantly. But as we look at the overlying soil layers that are saturated, we can see that pore pressures are being generated in all of these. The initial liquefaction is being reached in all of these, and we have strong stress reversals in every layer. We have positive shear stresses and negative shear stresses of about the same amplitude. So we have initial liquefaction occurring, the stiffness becomes very low in each of the layers, and we get large cyclic strains occurring in each of the layers. But we didn't have very much permanent deformation there. For the 2-degree slope, we see that initial liquefaction is reached only in 3 of the layers. It doesn't quite get there here, it doesn't quite get there here. We still have stress reversals in all of the layers. For the 2-degree slope now, each of these stress paths are starting with some non-zero static shear stress. And the cyclic shear stress from the ground motion is superimposed on top of that. But we still have significant reversals, but we're not triggering liquefaction in 2 of these layers. So effective stress is going to 0 in 3 of the 5 layers. The stiffness becomes very low in 3 of the 5 layers, but the stiffness doesn't drop a lot in these 2 layers. So we're getting significant cyclic strains, and we're also getting permanent strains occurring in these 3 layers that didn't liquefy. If we go to a 5-degree slope, now we've got a greater static shear stress, and our cyclic shear stress is being added to that. But we can see that our stresses don't reverse very much because we have a static shear stress that's lifting up these stress paths. We don't get very much negative shear stress. And so we're not going through a condition of 0 shear stress as frequently. We're only reaching liquefaction in this very top layer in this condition. So the stiffness is not degrading significantly in layers below this top layer. So we have relatively high stiffnesses here because the soil hasn't liquefied. And so we're only getting large cyclic and permanent strains in our top layer. And consequently, that's where the displacement is coming from. If we look at different programs for performing these analyses, we've used FLAC with the PM4 sand model, FLIP, a Japanese program developed by Professor Susumu Iai, OpenSeas, the PEER program, with Ahmed Argamal's PDMY model, and then the code that I have worked on. We get this kind of behavior occurring. This is from my model, and we see softening of the soil. We see phase transformation behavior with increase in stiffness. We can look and see whether this how much of a difference phase transformation behavior in this modeling makes by comparing the results of analyses performed with programs that capture phase transformation behavior and programs that don't. So we took did a series of analyses with, in this case, a 7-meter thick soil profile with a 15 blow per foot corrected SPT resistance. We did 2 types of analyses, one using deep soil, which has a pore pressure model that allows the generation of pore pressure, and it does that very nicely, but it doesn't capture phase transformation behavior. So it simply softens the backbone curve as the pore pressure is increased. When the pore pressure becomes very high, the effective stress becomes very low. The backbone curve, the stiffness of the soil, becomes extremely low, and it doesn't stiffen up as the real soil will. So it doesn't capture phase transformation behavior. And then we used my program that does capture that behavior and compared the results when we applied various motions to them. So here's the behavior shown by deep soil. It builds up pore line pressure in a reasonable way, at a reasonable rate. We don't see any dilation in this behavior. We don't see our pore pressures ever going down. They only increase. And when they increase to a high level, the stiffness goes quickly from being relatively high to suddenly becoming extremely low. very, very low stiffness. So initially it's stiff, pore pressure increases, then it becomes extremely soft. In a motion that captures phase transformation behavior, we're seeing similar rates of pore pressure generation at an early stage, but then we start to cross the phase transformation line with some large cycles here. We see dilation occurring, and we see phase transformation occurring here. We see the stiffening effect here, and we have initially stiff behavior, pore pressure increases and decreases, the soil profile softens, but it will show effects of dilation. Here's the acceleration time histories. Excuse me, they're predicted at the ground surface. They're similar in the early stages until liquefaction is triggered, and when liquefaction is triggered, the deep soil doesn't produce much response at all after that point, where we see effects of dilation occurring still in the PSNL record. If we look at the deep soil record, the stiffness essentially goes to zero, and so when upward traveling waves hit an extremely soft material, the great majority of that energy gets reflected back downward. It's almost like hitting a free surface there, where everything would be reflected. Very little and only very long period motions are transmitted above it. That's not the case when we have phase transformation behavior occurring. We can get these dilation pulses occurring. The biggest difference is when we start looking at deformations. Here are the peak accelerations that are predicted by the two motions as a function of depth. They're different, but they're not grossly different. Peak accelerations occur before liquefaction is triggered, though, and the two procedures are similar at that point. If we look at the displacements that are implied, however, PSNL has a displacement of peak displacement of less than a meter, and deep soil, because it has become so soft, has about 18 meters of displacement. And the soil above the base of the liquefied layer is essentially base isolated. So comparing different programs, we see differences in behavior. Here's a recorded motion from wildlife. Here are predictions of 4 different nonlinear effective stress programs. The recorded is on top. Early on, they're all predicting small and high frequency motions. They continue to predict higher frequency motions, some of them softer than others. They all show increases in amplitude as we reach the condition where liquefaction has occurred. They're all producing a reduction in high frequencies as the soil starts to liquefy and does liquefy, and they all produce weak motions afterwards. Some of them have more high frequency, kind of spurious oscillations. We see it in FLAC here, a little bit in FLIP. We see it in high frequency superimposed here in open seas that don't exist in the natural recorded motion. If we look at the development of dilation-induced pulses, we see that they appear pretty consistently in all of these records, but to different levels. So they all predict pressure generation consistently. They all capture post-triggering dilation pulses. The post-triggering behavior is a lot more complicated. We don't have much data to guide the constituent model calibration processes, and so the different programs will give different responses after liquefaction has been triggered, which means it's useful to perform these analyses with different programs. We can use some of these models are available to be used in two-dimensional analyses. I'll talk more about these later, but they can predict deformations by this way. So, to summarize, it's important to understand the mechanics of liquefaction in lateral spreading. We spent a lot of time talking about the basic mechanics of liquefiable soils, the state parameter concept, steady state concepts, tie all of this information together, and they're important for being able to perform and evaluate the results of analyses of this kind of behavior. So we made a lot of advances in modeling liquefiable soil behavior up to and beyond the point of initial liquefaction. We're pretty good at predicting the behavior up to the point of initial liquefaction. Our behavior is more complicated after liquefaction has been triggered. We're trying to generate data that helps us understand that behavior better. for predicting, making advanced predictions of permanent displacements. These analyses can be quite useful, but they should be checked with empirical procedures that are based on actual case histories, and the empirical procedures are more reliable predictors at this point. You have to look at the empirical procedures carefully to make sure that they're based on conditions that are similar to the conditions that you have to deal with. The record-to-record variability of ground motions leads to a lot of uncertainty, a lot of variation in things like permanent deformations and the occurrence of liquefaction. I've shown you some results for individual ground motions, but you would want to use multiple ground motions, as many as you can use to predict the overall expected behavior of a liquefiable soil profile. Numerical analyses can play a valuable role in helping you understand how a particular soil profile is going to behave, and how it may interact with a structure at your site. So it's not always obvious. The behavior can be so complicated that it can be difficult to interpret. I know in building my own program, there were many instances where I looked at some results and thought, that's not realistic. And I went and go back into my own code and understand why it happened. And it was not a problem with the code. It's just a complexity, almost chaotic complexity of the liquefaction process, and it's interaction of liquefiable soils with the waves that come into the profile. Okay, so that's an introduction. We'll talk more about numerical analyses a little bit later. I'll turn it over to Professor Brady.